would like to join the chorus, a chorus of thanks for Robert, Jack, and Jean-Marie in absence yesterday for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak to you this afternoon. The discovery of the Courtauld Venus in 2008 makes the earliest known representational object fashioned by human hands a small statuette of a woman made of mammoth ivory. Cognate with the first wind instruments and the extraordinary charcoal paintings of the Chauvet caves, the Courtauld Venus marks an appropriate, if idiosyncratic, conceptual and methodological starting point for the consideration of ivory statuettes carved in Gothic France. This miniature woman, with exaggerated breasts and swollen pudenda, intimates the deep history of humans crafting female forms of ivory and the centrality of ivory statuettes to human symbol formation. Arts of the Paleolithic, moreover, highlight the importance of materiality in understanding the mechanics of representation. Moving beyond what has been called the iconology of material, paleoanthropologists posit presentation as among the first fundamental symbolic acts, synecdoche being the simplest form of metaphor. Take, for example, the earliest flute found next to the Venus in the Courtauld caves outside of Ulm. The physical remains of a bird, its bones, were transformed through artisanal techniques into a tool capable of producing signs, varying acoustic tones, that signified or mimicked birdsong. The concatenation of representational modes is key. An art historian would describe this as a symbiotic relationship between material and iconography, an object in which craftsmanship does not surpass the material, but works together with it. The relationship between the material of mammoth ivory and the sexually exaggerated feminine forms in the imagination of the first Homo sapiens sapiens must remain shrouded in mystery, though many suggestions have been posited about fertility cults and the like. The relationship between elephant ivory and representations of the Virgin Mary in the Gothic period, however, is thankfully somewhat easier to reconstruct. The symbolic valences of ivory contributed substantially, I argue, to the formation and reception of statuettes of the Virgin and Child produced in Western Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. In the Middle Ages, ivory was understood to signify chastity, and thus was an appropriate, perhaps even the ideal, material from which to carve representations of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God. But I want to push this understanding beyond the largely conceptual relationship between signifier and signified to examine slippage between semiotic categories. In other words, to examine how ivory was conceived as being chastity. Let us then turn to the sources. The medieval interpretation of ivory stems from the 12 chapters Pliny the Elder had dedicated to the elephant in his natural history. Numerous tales illustrate that the elephant was not only considered a wise and ethical animal, but also that the species' mating habits were particularly modest, and that they were considered physiologically cold-blooded. The myth of elephants' cold blood stemmed from the story Pliny recounted regarding the elephant and the dragon's mortal enmity. In the parching heat of summer, the already febrile dragon sought the cold blood of the elephant to quench his thirst. In satiating himself on the blood of a cold elephant, the dragon thus kills the giant beast, and is in its turn crushed to death by the behemoth's final fall. Given the length of Pliny's writings on the subject, it is not surprising that different intellectual traditions absorbed and transmitted different aspects of the text. The bestiary tradition, as you see here in this 12th century example, focused on the deathly battle between the elephant and dragon, while biblical commentators, for their part, quickly fixated on elephants' cold-blooded nature and their modest reproductive habits. The two elements were associated in a causal relationship as sexual frigidity, or rather chastity. a physiological interpretation was thus forged between the qualities of coldness and the virtue of chastity. Thus, in his 6th century commentary on the Psalms, Cassiodorus remarked, "The elephant to whom these bones, that is ivory, belong is said to be most chaste. Among quadrupeds, he is endowed with the highest intelligence, his intercourse with his mate is disciplined, and he enjoys no second spouse. The elephant's moral predisposition accrued to the substance of ivory, and it was thus given the same continent interpretation." The passage from Cassiodorus is taken from his commentary on the ivory palace of Psalm 44. Myrrh and stagtape and cassia, perfumed thy garments. From ivory houses the daughters of kings have delighted thee in thy glory. Thus Christ's bride fittingly emerges from the house of chastity. And as an aside, we have to wonder what the scribe of this manuscript, who so faithfully drew Charlemagne's elephant Abulabus on folio 9 of this manuscript, thought of Cassiodorus' interpretation when he transcribed it some 20 folios later, 120 folios later. Coining an enduring formula, he the Venerable in the 8th century summarized thusly: ivory properly signifies chastity, which remains immune in the flesh from the corruption of the sins of the flesh. Biologically, therefore, elephants were thought to have cold blood, a fact that was correlated with their chaste behavior. The tusks, as just one part of these animals, stood for the whole animal, including their attributes of coldness and chasteness. Thus, pars pro toto, ivory tusks point to qualities of cold beast. The language of medieval exegetes is quite clear about this, using indicapi or syndicapi to underscore the semiotic function. Yet it is possible to push this hermeneutics beyond signification and to argue, borrowing a phrase coined by Guérin for the vital materiality of ivory, thus comprehending the connection between ivory and chastity as not merely symbolic, but as an embodiment and incarnation of the virtue of chastity in the material itself. The elision between representation and presence is strongly felt in Anselm of Laon's 12th century commentary on the Song of Songs, namely in discussing the passage from chapter 5 that describes the mystical lover with a belly of ivory set with sapphires. Following the Pauline equation that Christ is the head of the church, he is the savior of his body, Anselm offered a particularly corporate and ecclesiological reading of the ivory body of the lover in the Canticles. Venter eius, the softest part of the church, that is the married lay people who enjoy the pleasures of the world, are of ivory, that is chastity. Indeed, the elephant is of a cold nature, and it is from this that ivory signifies chastity. Ivory is of such a frigid nature that if you place a burning cloth on top of ivory, it will not ignite. Anselm walks us, the reader, through his logical steps. It is the elephant that is cold, and it passes its frigidity to the ivory, infusing its tusks with coldness, the sign of chasteness. Anselm then offers a quasi-scientific and seemingly verifiable proof of ivory's physical coldness. The icy essence of ivory will, according to Anselm, resist flames and not burn. While contemporary ivory politics have unfortunately reminded us that ivory does indeed burn, it in fact does so at a much higher temperature than wood, even hardwoods, and one wonders whether experimentation lies behind Anselm's exegesis. I have not found an earlier instance of the trope of burning cloth and ivory in Arabic or classical sources, but a passage from Thomas of Canterbury's book On the Nature of Things from the 13th century proposes that Anselm's knowledge of the physical properties of ivory may in fact stem from practical experience. In the several pages that Thomas dedicates to the elephant, he notes, these adult teeth of elephants are 2 cubits long and curve upwards. When burnt, these teeth make a powder which physicians call spodium. This powder stops the bleeding of the lymph nodes from its chilling effect. Against flux of the stomach, of menstruation, or of hemorrhoids, it is given with the juice of plants. Anselm's knowledge of the efficaciousness of ivory in extinguishing fires may be informed by contemporary medical practices. Thomas clearly states that burnt ivory powder maintained its chilling effect. As an inherently cold material, ivory was indeed a powerful component of drugs concocted within the Galenic system, the system taught at medical schools in the 13th century, including the Parisian ones. Ivory shavings, as well as ivory powder, were used interchangeably in pharmaceuticals. And I suspect that this is because burning made the ivory powder more soluble, though perhaps there's a chemist lingering here among you who can answer that for me. The late 11th century gynecologist Courtauld of Salerno prescribed to her patients a drink of ivory to guard against miscarriage, cooling down and soothing wounds. In the Antidotarium Nicolai, the most widely circulated compilation of prescriptions from 12th century physician Nicholas of Salerno, ivory shavings are included in 9 of its 140 recipes. Most indicative of ivory's frigid nature is its presence in the recipe for Coffon's cold electuary, which is to be taken in case of fever or stomach cholera, an extra heat of the stomach. Ivory shavings joined other cooling ingredients in this remedy, including red and white sandalwood, tragacanth gum arabic, rhubarb, senna, roses, violets, seeds of common fumitory, barberry, berries, purslane, 3 drachms of anise, fennel, and 1 ounce of ambelica, that is, Indian gooseberry. Frigid ivory joins the other strongly cooling ingredients, most notably rose, fennel, and anise. In the Materia Medica, ivory shavings are listed among the pharmacologically active substances as being cold and dry to the 1st degree. And when he included it among a list of ingredients for drugs, the 13th century Parisian doctor Jean of Saint-Amand testified to ivory's continued use as a pharmaceutical, absolutely contemporary with the production of Gothic ivory statuettes in that city. The medical use of ivory demonstrated the qualities and virtues inherent in the material itself, proposing that for the medieval viewer, the presence of ivory did not merely signify chastity, but actually embodied it. The peculiar, perhaps scientific interpretation offered by Anselm of Laon of ivory being resistant to fire was taken up by several later writers, both in Latin and in vernacular French, including Honorius Augustuensis, Philip of Harvey, and Peter Bobet and his Picard Bestiary. Yet, perhaps most interesting of these is the reiteration of Anselm's interpretation by Jacques de Vitry in his Historia Orientalis from around 1215. They, elephants, are of a cold nature, and ivory, which is their bones, is cold and white. For if a cloth is placed on top of an ivory, and both are placed on a fire, the cloth will not burn, but the natural coldness of the ivory, it is said, will extinguish the fire. His careful elaboration on Anselm's interpretation suggests to the reader that Jacques had a first-hand knowledge of ivory, describing it itself as cold. While it cannot be known whether Anselm had direct access to an ivory object at Laon, we know with certainty that Jacques de Vitry did, as his ivory bishop's crozier is still extant as part of the treasure from the priory of Ogny, his first religious house, and where Jacques donated all of his belongings after his death. Of Sicilian manufacture and probably purchased in Rome just before he took up his episcopal office Outremer and Ars in 1216, the purchase of Jacques' ivory crozier is absolutely contemporary with his writing of the Historia Orientalis. One wonders how his written opinion of ivory was influenced by his lived experience of handling and manipulating his magnificent crozier. Was he ever tempted to verify the information provided by the textual authorities? And there are thankfully no burn marks on this object. Did the experience of taking up his crozier on a hot Mediterranean day, swathed and sweating in heavy liturgical robes and silks, to find it refreshingly cool to the touch, confirm in his mind the exegesis of the material. In such a circumstance, would he have believed the physical sensation of coolness to be the manifestation of its chastity? Did this concretized virtue cool his spirit as well as his cheek? Ivory thus did not simply signify chastity, but exegetical and pharmaceutical evidence proposes that the physical manifestation of the coldness of ivory was coextensive with its chastity. As Jacques de Vitry, the medieval pharmacist, and many in this audience to know, ivory is cold to the touch, and it is a small step conceptually to believe that this coldness must also be chastity. Turning back to the Gothic ivory statuettes, the substantial presence of chastity in ivory not only makes it the most appropriate material with which to fashion statuettes of the Virgin Mary herself, but the actual physical presence of her chief virtue in the medium pushes Gothic statuettes of the Virgin past representation into presentation. It makes the Virgin's virginity present actually and palpably. What are the implications of this vital materiality of ivory on the variety of objects carved in the medium, for both public and private consumption? When considering large-scale Virgin and Child statuettes, many of which have provenance from such important church treasuries, such as the Parisian Saint-Chapelle, the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, or the Collegiate Church in Villeneuve-les-Avignon, which you see here, it seems from the sparse documentary evidence that these statuettes were either to stand permanently on altars dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin, as evidence from the Duomo in Pisa and the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris show, or, as at the Austrian Abbey at Zwettl, were brought out of the sacristy or treasury to the Virgin's altar on her feast days, of which the Assumption was the most solemn, receiving in many places triplet status in the 13th century. I stress the Feast of the Assumption, precisely because it is the event in Mary's life, or rather afterlife, that removed her bodily presence from the faithful. When her corpse was assumed into heaven after the Virgin's death, the corporeal link that Christians so craved was rendered impossible. Yearning for Mary's somatic presence was futile, though such secondary relics as her girdle, garments, veil, shoes, house, etc., were frequently adduced to fill the gap. Theologians repeatedly explained, in fact, that it was precisely because of her chastity, her body as perfect container for God incarnate, that her corpse was taken up to heaven. Her remains were too precious, suffused as they were by her pure virtue, to rot and be the food of worms. In the apocryphal account of her Assumption, Christ himself, echoing the Song of Songs, proclaims, "Arise, my love, my dove, my tabernacle of glory, vessel of life, celestial temple. Because you did not suffer the stain of sin through intercourse, you shall not suffer the dissolution of the body in the grave." What better way to fully recognize the full significance of the feast than an ivory statuette? Bodily relics of her virginal flesh were impossible, but a representation of the Mother of God could be supplemented by the physical presence of chastity in the material of ivory. It is not simply a symbol, but a physical manifestation of Mary's chief virtue. On a day when it is precisely the absence of the Virgin's body that is being celebrated, an ivory statuette did not merely represent, but made her unique virtue felt through the materiality of ivory, in a phenomenon that surpassed even secondary relics. Curiously, some of the earliest Gothic ivory statuettes were fitted as reliquary containers. The Petite statuette in Hamburg from the early 13th century has a compartment, presumably for relics, carved into its back. The statuette was hewn from a half-cylindrical section of tusk, with a flat back having been hollowed to form a chamber at the base of the statuette. Lips along the vertical edges of the compartment served to hold a sliding door, and the two bore holes on either side of the compartment were likely to secure the statuette within a tabernacle. Such cavities, however, were all but abandoned in the next generation, the apogee of Gothic ivory statuettes. It seems, therefore, that the materiality of ivory, the physical presence of chastity, eclipsed the presence of a secondary relic, and the relic's inclusion was gradually deemed unnecessary. Ivory made the Virgin Mary's essence, her vital virtue, present more forcefully than even could relics. Another curious conjunction of ivory and relic, which enriches the theological background here outlined, is a reliquary of the True Cross in the parish church of Saint-Étienne-Valedon that came from the treasury of the Abbey of Courtauld. An ivory plaque of the face of the Virgin is mounted as the central door of a quatrefoil reliquary, typical of Limoges work in the mid-13th century. It is difficult to conceive that the plaque was being crafted for its present location, and Daniel Gabaly-Chopin has suggested that it was from a central compartment of the polyptych. The 4 bands of 12th century filigree that frame the door suggest a pastiche, likely, I would argue, from the late 13th century. When it was described in the inventory of Cremont in 1495, the ivory plaque was identified with St. Veronica, but I would suggest that placing the face of an ivory virgin on the door of the relic chamber enacted a theological truth. Pieces of the True Cross, worshipped, as Thomas Aquinas affirmed in the 13th century, because they bear the blood of Christ himself, are hidden underneath the chaste ivory of the Virgin, just as Mary herself encompassed and enclosed Christ. Thus, following what Sita Changati has called the poetics of the reliquary, the essential quality of one thing containing another, the rhetoric of enshrinement plays out as a relationship between the flesh of the mother, ivory, and that of her son, cross relic. The reuse of an ivory statuette of the Virgin proposes a deep understanding and purposeful play on the significance of ivory. Thus, the exegetical and medical interpretation of ivory, linking frigidity and chastity, leads to the understanding of ivory statuettes of the Virgin and Child as objects that both depict and are the thing represented, i.e. the embodiment of virgin chastity. Yet what happens when these objects are taken from the sacred spaces from which they were fashioned? What happens when this precious substance and its embodiment of chastity are used for profane objects? Does the interpretation still hold? Is ivory's materiality forgotten? I would argue no. Chastity remains central to the object's meaning. Let us take, in closing, a casket with courtly scenes today at the Louvre, which is among the first secular ivories of the Gothic period and can be dated to around 1300 or 1320. The signs of this small object depict lovers cavorting in a compressed rectilinear space. The lid is adorned with 4 Gothic arches separating additional vignettes of lovers, caressing one another and exchanging signs of love. Like the roughly contemporary mirror backs depicting lovers playing chess or scenes of couples hunting, replete with sexual innuendos Michael Camille unpacked for us so well, the small ivory casket speaks a secular language of love, flirtation, and seduction. These themes engaged by the secular ivories do not simply ignore the materiality of ivory as chastity, but rather they turn it on its ear. Akin to the contemporary polyphonic motets that juxtaposed courtly vernacular love lyrics with liturgical chants, the playful appropriation of religious forms for the sake of amusement and humor was commonplace in Gothic Paris. And I would argue that a similar aesthetic of a risque mixture of secular and profane is present in these caskets. Yet it is not merely a matter of inversion or a world turned upside down, flaunting an otherwise revered material. The iconography of the secular ivory specifically turns chastity to promiscuity, and the experience of its very materiality deepened the clever formulation. While ivory is initially cool to the touch, it warms quickly to body temperature when handled. Instead of an object meant to inhabit a Scopic economy, as the chaste virgin's flesh in the churches, the miniature casket at the Louvre was an item of use, to be picked up, cradled in one's hands, opened and closed and set down again. The phenomenon of changing temperature of the ivory box revises the metaphor on which ivory's chastity is based. If ivory is chaste because of its frigidity, or if its frigidity is its chastity, as Jacques de Vitry experienced, what of its yielding nature, its acquiescence to human heat and passion when fondled and caressed? A luxuriant and suggestive object, indeed, to gift a beloved, who might be expected to accept such fervent advances as depicted on the casket itself. It is the physical transformation of the physical qualities, the transformation from cold to hot, from the coolness of chastity to the fires of passion, that contributes substantially to the reception of the secular objects and belongs to these objects' narrative. Thank you.